Melanie had always lived a life of quiet struggles, her days consumed by caring for her ailing mother and scraping by to make ends meet. Despite her hardships, she carried herself with grace and determination, her love for her mother giving her strength. But everything changed when a man from her past, a man she had never expected to see again, appeared on her doorstep. Don Salvador, her estranged biological father, exuded an aura of wealth and power that contrasted sharply with Melanie's humble surroundings. His sudden presence was unsettling, but the words he spoke shook her to her core. "Your twin sister, Candace, has passed away," Don Salvador said, his voice a mixture of regret and desperation. "Her husband, Brayll, doesn't know yet. I need you to take her place, Melanie. Pretend to be her. He can't know the truth, not yet." Melanie's heart stopped. The man who had abandoned her and her mother years ago was now asking her to live a life of deception. Her initial reaction was anger, but then Don Salvador revealed his bargaining chip. "If you do this," he said, his voice heavy with insistence, "I'll cover your mother's medical expenses. Everything, hospital bills, treatments, medicines, paid in full. I'll also ensure you never have to worry about money again." The offer was tempting, but it came with a moral price. How could she betray a grieving husband by pretending to be his deceased wife? The guilt was suffocating, yet the vision of her mother lying helplessly in bed haunted her. After days of anguish, sleepless nights, and tear-filled prayers, Melanie made the hardest decision of her life. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "but this is for my mother, not for you." Melanie's transformation into Candace was a rigorous and emotionally draining process. Under Don Salvador's watchful eye, she was coached on how to mimic every aspect of her twin's life. From the way Candace walked to her unique mannerisms, Melanie had to embody her sister completely. Candace had been polished and confident, qualities Melanie had never embraced herself. Hours were spent studying old videos and photographs, memorizing her sister's speech patterns, and even learning her taste in fashion and music. Each new lesson felt like a piece of Melanie's true self was slipping away. Remember, Candace was always composed. Don Salvador reminded her sternly during a lesson. No fidgeting, no hesitation. When the day came for Melanie to step into Brayll's home, she was consumed by fear. The grand mansion loomed before her, its marble columns and sprawling gardens a stark contrast to her modest upbringing. As the housekeeper opened the door, Melanie stepped inside, her breath hitching at the opulence that surrounded her. Brayll greeted her with a mixture of relief and longing. "Candace," he said softly, his eyes scanning her face, "you're finally home." Melanie forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the love in his eyes, but also a shadow of uncertainty. He reached out to embrace her, and she stiffened momentarily before returning the gesture. Life as Candace was an intricate dance of lies and half-truths. Melanie found herself constantly on edge, terrified that one slip-up would unravel everything. Brayll's sharp mind and observant nature made it even harder to maintain the charade. "You've changed," Brayll remarked one evening as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. His tone was casual, but his gaze was piercing. "It's like you're different." Melanie swallowed hard, masking her unease with a soft laugh. "Maybe the time apart gave me a new perspective," she replied, hoping her voice sounded natural. Despite her fears, there were moments when Melanie felt a genuine connection with Brayll. He would share stories of his dreams, his ambitions, and the life he envisioned with Candace. With each passing day, Melanie found herself falling for him, a dangerous emotion given the circumstances. But maintaining the facade wasn't without its challenges. Melanie struggled to recall shared memories Brayll brought up, her answers often vague or evasive. Brayll noticed the small inconsistencies, the way she now avoided her sister's favorite meals or her reluctance to talk about certain topics. The pressure mounted as Brayll's suspicions grew. One evening, after a particularly tense conversation, Melanie locked herself in the bathroom, tears streaming down her face. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman she saw. "This isn't me," she whispered, clutching the edge of the sink. "But I have to do this. For Mom." Despite the growing cracks in her facade, Melanie clung to the hope that she could hold everything together. She prayed that Brayll would never discover the truth and that her love for him wouldn't betray her. Melanie was beginning to settle into the routine of her new life as Candace. Each day presented new challenges, yet she managed to navigate them with painstaking effort. Brayll was attentive, loving, and doting, making it harder for Melanie to carry the weight of her deception. One morning, as Melanie descended the grand staircase, Brayll greeted her with breakfast already prepared. He stood in the kitchen, wearing a casual apron, a sight that made her heart ache. "Good morning, love," he said, flashing her a warm smile. Melanie forced herself to return his affection, kissing him softly on the cheek. "Good morning, Brayll. This looks amazing," she said, gesturing to the spread of food on the table. Brayll chuckled. "I thought you deserved to be spoiled today. You've been working so hard lately." As they sat down to eat, Brayll began reminiscing about a trip they had taken to Paris, a memory that wasn't hers. Melanie felt her chest tighten, her mind scrambling for the right responses. "Do you remember the little cafe near the Seine? You insisted we try every dessert on the menu," Brayll said, his eyes sparkling with fondness. Melanie smiled weakly. "Of course. How could I forget?" she lied, praying he wouldn't press further. Moments like these were becoming more frequent, and Melanie's anxiety grew with each passing day. She couldn't shake the feeling that Brayll was watching her more closely, scrutinizing her every word and action. Melanie's struggle to maintain her facade deepened when she discovered Candace's personal journal hidden in the back of a drawer. The leather-bound book was filled with entries about Brayll, their love, and the life they had built together. Reading through the pages, Melanie felt a mixture of guilt and envy. Candace's words painted a vivid picture of a passionate and devoted relationship. "He looks at me like I'm his entire world," one entry read. "I've never felt so loved." The journal became Melanie's lifeline, a way to piece together the history she was pretending to be part of. She spent nights poring over its contents, memorizing details about Candace's favorite places, habits, and moments with Brayll. One evening, as she sat in the study reading the journal, Brayll walked in unexpectedly. Melanie hastily closed the book, her heart pounding. "What are you reading?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes curious. "Just an old journal," Melanie replied, holding the book tightly. Brayll raised an eyebrow. Candace always kept a journal. She said it helped her process her thoughts. Melanie nodded, forcing a smile. "It's comforting," she said softly, hoping he wouldn't ask to see it. As Brayll walked over to her, Melanie braced herself for more questions. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and kissed her forehead. "I'm glad you're finding peace," he said. Despite her best efforts, Melanie's facade began to crack. Brayll's growing suspicions were becoming harder to ignore. One afternoon, as they were sorting through some old photo albums, Brayll pointed to a picture of Candace wearing a gold bracelet. "You always said this bracelet was your favorite," he remarked. "Why don't you wear it anymore?" Melanie froze, her mind racing for an explanation. "Oh, I thought I lost it," she said hesitantly. Brayll's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's strange. I saw it in the jewelry box just last week." Melanie forced a laugh, trying to deflect. "Maybe I just misplaced it. I'll look for it later." Brayll didn't press the issue further, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Later that night, as Melanie lay in bed, she felt the weight of her lies pressing down on her. The love Brayll showed her was real, but it wasn't meant for her. It was meant for Candace. The guilt was suffocating, yet she couldn't bring herself to confess the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted when Brayll entered the room, his face unreadable. He sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on her. "Melanie," he began, using her real name for the first time. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. Did he know? "I just want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always love you," he said softly. The words sent a jolt of pain through Melanie's heart. She wanted to believe him, but she knew the truth would shatter everything. As Brayll lay down beside her and pulled her into his arms, Melanie silently wept, her tears soaking the pillow. She had never felt more loved and more trapped. Melanie's days felt like walking a tightrope, every step fraught with the risk of discovery. Despite her growing affection for Brayll, the guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. The love he showed her felt pure and unconditional, yet she knew it was rooted in a lie. One morning, as they sat on the balcony sipping coffee, Brayll reached out and took Melanie's hand. His touch was warm, grounding, but his words carried a weight that made her stomach churn. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes scanning the horizon. "About us, about everything Candace and I used to talk about for our future. I want to make those dreams a reality." Melanie's throat tightened. "Oh, what kind of dreams?" she asked, feigning interest while suppressing the panic rising in her chest. "Expanding the business, maybe starting a family," Brayll said with a smile, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. "I feel like we've been through so much, and it's time to look forward." Melanie nodded, forcing a smile. "That sounds wonderful," she said, though the thought of building a future on the foundation of her deception felt unbearable. Later that evening, as Melanie sorted through the wardrobe, she found a box labeled Memories. It contained photographs, handwritten notes, and trinkets from Brayll and Candace's life together. Each item felt like a dagger to her heart, a reminder of the life she had stolen. She held a photo of Brayll and Candace, both beaming with happiness, and tears spilled down her cheeks. How long could she keep up this charade? The tension in Melanie's life reached new heights when Brayll's best friend, Lucas, came to visit. Lucas had known Candace well and was immediately struck by subtle differences in Melanie's behavior. "Something's different about you," Lucas remarked during dinner, his sharp eyes fixed on Melanie. Melanie's heart raced. "Oh, how so?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "You used to hate red wine," Lucas said, gesturing to the glass in her hand. "Now you seem to enjoy it." Melanie laughed nervously. "Tastes change, I suppose," she said, hoping the conversation would shift. But Lucas wasn't easily deterred. Throughout the evening, he asked probing questions about memories and events from Candace's past. Melanie deflected as best as she could, but she could feel Brayll's gaze on her, his expression unreadable. After Lucas left, Brayll confronted Melanie. "Why didn't you tell me Lucas made you uncomfortable?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Melanie hesitated, searching for the right words. "I didn't want to make a scene," she said finally. Brayll nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, as if searching for something she wasn't saying. Melanie's carefully constructed world began to unravel when she received a call from her estranged father. "You've done well for yourself, Melanie," his voice sneered through the phone. "Living the high life, aren't you?" Melanie's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just a little help," he said. "You wouldn't want your rich husband to know about your little secret, would you?" Melanie's heart pounded as she realized the precariousness of her situation. If her father exposed the truth, everything would come crashing down. Desperate to protect her life with Brayll, Melanie met her father in secret. The encounter was tense, filled with thinly veiled threats and demands for money. "Just give me enough to get by," her father said, his tone smug. "You owe me that much for leaving me behind." Melanie handed him the cash she had saved, her hands trembling. "This is the last time," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father wouldn't let go so easily. Back at home, Brayll sensed her distress. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. Melanie nodded, burying her face in his chest. "I'm just tired," she said, though the truth weighed heavily on her soul. As Brayll held her, Melanie silently vowed to find a way to end the lies and protect the man she had come to love. But with every passing day, the truth loomed larger, threatening to destroy everything she held dear. Melanie found herself spiraling deeper into guilt as Brayll's unwavering affection contrasted starkly with her deception. Each gesture of kindness, each affectionate glance, became a reminder of how much she had taken from him and how little he truly knew about her. One evening, while Brayll was reviewing documents in his study, Melanie ventured into the garden. The moonlight bathed the space in a silvery glow, casting shadows across the carefully manicured lawn. Melanie sat on the bench where Brayll had once proposed to Candace, clutching a diary she had discovered among Candace's belongings. Flipping through the pages, Melanie read entries filled with Candace's dreams, fears, and profound love for Brayll. The words felt like a punch to her gut. Brayll makes me feel safe, loved. I want to give him the world, just as he's given me everything. Melanie closed the diary, tears streaming down her face. Candace's love for Brayll was undeniable, and it only magnified Melanie's internal conflict. How could she ever live up to the woman Brayll had lost? Was she doing more harm than good by staying in his life? When she returned inside, Brayll was waiting in the living room. His eyes softened as they landed on her tear-streaked face. "Melanie, is something wrong?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. She shook her head quickly. "No, just memories," she whispered, forcing a smile. Brayll studied her for a moment before pulling her into a hug. "I don't know what's been bothering you lately, but I'm here for you," he murmured against her hair. Melanie clung to him, wishing she could freeze time. She wanted so badly to tell him the truth, but fear paralyzed her. For now, she could only hope that she could protect him from the pain her revelations would surely bring. Melanie's facade began to crack further when Lucas, Brayll's sharp-eyed best friend, returned for another visit. This time, he brought along Brayll's mother, Mrs. Orlon, who had always been incredibly close to Candace. Melanie felt her nerves fraying as she prepared dinner for everyone. Her hands shook as she chopped vegetables, and she nearly dropped a plate when Lucas entered the kitchen. "You seem tense," Lucas remarked, leaning casually against the counter. His piercing gaze seemed to strip away every layer of Melanie's defenses. "I'm fine," Melanie said quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Are you?" Lucas asked, his tone low and challenging. "Because something about you doesn't sit right with me." Melanie stiffened. Before she could respond, Mrs. Orlon walked in, her warm presence diffusing the tension. "Dinner smells wonderful, dear," Mrs. Orlon said, smiling at Melanie. But as the older woman reached out to touch Melanie's arm, her expression shifted subtly. "Your hands, they're rougher than I remember," she commented softly. Melanie's stomach dropped. She fumbled for a response, her mind racing. "I've taken up gardening," she said, forcing a laugh. "It's a new hobby." Mrs. Orlon nodded, but her eyes held a flicker of doubt. Throughout the evening, Melanie could feel both Lucas and Mrs. Orlon watching her closely, as though they were piecing together a puzzle. After dinner, Brayll noticed Melanie's unease and pulled her aside. "Melanie, what's going on?" he asked, his tone firm but gentle. She shook her head, her heart pounding. "Nothing, Brayll. I'm just tired." Brayll didn't press further, but the worry in his eyes was clear. Melanie knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. The tipping point came when Melanie received an unexpected phone call from her estranged father. "Melanie," his voice oozed through the receiver, "I need your help again." Her blood ran cold. "I told you, I don't have anything else to give you," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't play coy," he sneered. "You're living the high life, aren't you? Married to that rich man. I'm sure you can spare something for your dear old dad." Melanie's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not Candace," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "Doesn't matter," he shot back. "You're wearing her face, living her life. I wonder how your precious husband would feel if he found out." Melanie's knees buckled as the weight of his threat sank in. She ended the call abruptly, her hands shaking as she leaned against the wall. Later that night, Brayll found her sitting alone in the darkened living room. "Melanie, you've been so distant lately," he said, sitting beside her. "Talk to me. Whatever it is, we can face it together." Melanie looked at him, her heart aching. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she tell him that she wasn't the woman he thought she was? That the love he felt for her was built on a lie? "I'm sorry, Brayll," she whispered instead, tears spilling down her cheeks. Brayll pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it," he promised. But Melanie knew that wasn't true. The truth would shatter everything, and she wasn't sure if their love could survive the fallout. Melanie's world began to spin out of control as the weight of her lies pressed harder against her. Every glance from Brayll felt like a knife cutting into her soul, not because of malice but because of his trust that she knew she didn't deserve. One quiet morning, Brayll suggested they visit one of their favorite parks. It was a place Candace had adored, and Melanie had taken to frequenting to keep up appearances. They packed a light picnic and made their way to the spot under the sprawling acacia tree where they used to spend countless afternoons. "You've seemed so distant lately, Melanie," Brayll said as he spread the blanket. His deep voice was steady, but there was a hint of unease in it. "Is there something on your mind?" Melanie froze, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. She wanted to say something, anything that might lighten the mood, but the guilt was like a lump in her throat. I've just been overwhelmed, that's all," she said finally, forcing a weak smile. Brayll leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "You can tell me anything, you know that." The sincerity in his voice was unbearable. Melanie quickly turned away, pretending to adjust their picnic basket. "I know, Brayll," she murmured. "I'll be fine." But as the day wore on, Brayll's suspicion grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He resolved to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant uncovering truths he wasn't ready to face. Later that week, Melanie received another phone call from her estranged father. His tone was sharper this time, dripping with thinly veiled threats. "I've been patient, Melanie," he growled, "but patience has its limits. If you don't want me to ruin your little charade, you'd better come up with something, and fast." Melanie's hands trembled as she clutched the phone. "I don't have anything to give you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'd better find a way," he snapped, "because I'm not above knocking on Brayll's door myself." The line went dead, leaving Melanie in a state of panic. She knew she had to find a way to protect Brayll from her father's schemes, but every option seemed to lead to disaster. That evening, while Brayll worked late in his study, Melanie sat in their bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "I have to end this," she whispered to herself, "before it destroys him." But how? How could she walk away without breaking his heart, or worse, leaving him vulnerable to the fallout of her deceit? Brayll's growing suspicions finally led him to investigate. He started noticing inconsistencies, little things that didn't add up. Melanie's preferences, her reactions to familiar places, even the way she interacted with his family and friends. It was all subtly different from what he remembered about Candace. One night, he approached Lucas, his best friend, who had always been skeptical about Melanie. "Lucas," Brayll began, his voice low, "do you think Melanie has changed?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't want to say anything, but yes, something about her doesn't feel right. Have you talked to her about it?" Brayll shook his head. "Not yet. I need more proof. If I confront her now, I might push her away, or worse, I might be wrong." But the opportunity to uncover the truth came sooner than Brayll expected. While cleaning their room, he stumbled upon a hidden box tucked away in Melanie's closet. Inside were letters addressed to her from her father, along with a small photo of Melanie and Candace as children. The resemblance between the twins was uncanny, but it was clear that Melanie wasn't Candace. Brayll's heart sank as he pieced everything together. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had been building a life with, wasn't his wife at all. That evening, Brayll confronted Melanie. He placed the box on the dining table and looked her straight in the eye. "Explain this," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. Melanie's heart raced as she realized there was no escape. "Brayll, Who are you, Melanie?" Brayll demanded. "Who are you really?" Tears streamed down Melanie's face as she finally confessed everything: her father's coercion, her mother's illness, and her decision to pose as Candace to save her family. "I never meant to hurt you," she sobbed. I didn't have a choice. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Brayll's expression was unreadable as he listened. When she finished, he stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. "I trusted you," he said finally, his voice cold. "I gave you everything, and you lied to me." "I'm sorry," Melanie whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this to happen." But Brayll couldn't look at her anymore. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Melanie alone with the weight of her actions. The air in the house was heavy with silence, a stark contrast to the warmth and laughter it once held. Melanie sat on the living room couch, staring blankly at the scattered contents of her secret box now lying on the coffee table. Brayll's footsteps echoed faintly from the upstairs bedroom, and each sound felt like a dagger in her heart. She had tried knocking on his door, tried pleading for him to listen to her again, but Brayll had remained unyielding. His refusal to acknowledge her was a silent punishment far worse than any words he could have thrown her way. By morning, Brayll emerged from the room, his face impassive. Melanie, still clutching a cold cup of coffee, looked up at him with eyes swollen from crying. "Brayll," she started, but he cut her off with a sharp glance. "I'm going to my parents' house," he said flatly. "I need time to think." The words left Melanie breathless. This wasn't just about needing space. It was about creating distance between them. She wanted to reach out, to grab his hand and beg him to stay, but she knew it would only push him further away. "When will you be back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Without another glance, Brayll walked out the door, leaving Melanie to crumble under the weight of her grief. The next few days were a blur of emptiness. Melanie wandered through the house like a ghost, her once vibrant presence now a shadow of what it had been. Memories of their shared moments played like a cruel montage in her mind. The laughter, the whispered confessions, the promises of forever. Desperate for clarity, she decided to visit her mother in the province. Maybe being with family would help her find the strength to face the fallout of her choices. "Mom," she said as she embraced the older woman, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've made such a mess of everything." Her mother held her tightly, stroking her hair. "Tell me what happened, Anik," she said gently. Through sobs, Melanie recounted everything. Her father's manipulation, her decision to impersonate Candace, and the love that had grown between her and Brayll. Her mother listened intently, her expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "Melanie," her mother said softly, "you did what you thought was right for our family, but love built on lies can never thrive. You need to let him go for now." Those words struck a chord in Melanie. For the first time, she realized that perhaps the only way to salvage what was left of her relationship with Brayll was to give him the space he needed to heal. Meanwhile, at his parents' house, Brayll was battling his own inner turmoil. He had told himself that leaving Melanie would help him think clearly, but the distance only seemed to amplify his pain. His mother, ever perceptive, noticed his unrest. One afternoon, she sat beside him in the garden, where he had been silently brooding. "Brayll," she said gently, "what's troubling you?" He hesitated, then sighed deeply. "It's Melanie, or Candace. I don't even know anymore." His mother frowned. "What do you mean?" Brayll explained everything. How he had discovered Melanie's true identity, her reasons for deceiving him, and the feelings of betrayal that consumed him. "Do you still love her?" his mother asked after a long pause. The question caught him off guard. Did he? Despite everything, the thought of losing Melanie for good was unbearable. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't stop thinking about her." His mother placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Love is never simple, Brayll. But if you truly care for her, you owe it to yourself and to her to find out if forgiveness is possible." That evening, Brayll sat in his old room, staring at a photo of him and Candace. But as he looked closer, he realized that the memories tied to the photo felt distant. The moments he cherished most were those he had shared with Melanie, not as Candace, but as the woman she truly was. Determined to seek closure, Brayll decided to return home. He wasn't sure what he would say to Melanie, but he knew he needed to hear her out. When he arrived, the house felt emptier than he had anticipated. Melanie's absence was palpable, and for the first time, he feared she might have left for good. On the dining table, he found a note in Melanie's handwriting. Brayll, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for the love you gave me, even if it wasn't meant for me. I'm going back to the province to be with my mother. If you ever decide that you can forgive me, you know where to find me. With all my love, Melanie. Brayll's chest tightened as he read the letter. He realized that despite everything, he couldn't let her go. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed his keys and headed to the province. Days turned into weeks, and Melanie found solace in her mother's embrace. The simple life in the province was a far cry from the luxurious chaos she had left behind with Brayll. Yet, the ache of separation never faded. Every sunset reminded her of the life she had once built and lost. One evening, as she sat on the porch, gazing at the horizon, a familiar car pulled up the dirt road. Her breath hitched as she saw Brayll step out, his expression unreadable. Brayll? Melanie whispered, her voice barely audible. He walked toward her slowly, his every step measured and deliberate. The air between them was thick with emotion, guilt, anger, longing, an overwhelming cocktail of feelings neither had fully unpacked. Melanie, Brayll said, his voice rough yet soft, like he was afraid to break the moment. I've come to talk. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she remained composed. You came all this way? She asked, masking the tremble in her voice. Yes. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to say what needed to be said. I need answers. But more than that, I need you. Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes. She had prepared herself for this moment, yet the floodgates opened anyway. Brayll, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am. He reached for her hands, gently holding them between his own. I love you, Melanie. I may have been angry, hurt, betrayed, but you're the only one who's ever truly seen me. As the night unfolded, their conversation deepened. They revisited memories, shared stories, and explored the pain they both harbored. The truth of Melanie's actions was never easy for Brayll to hear, but his heart softened with each word she spoke. Melanie explained everything: the deceit, her mother's illness, and the desperate need to save her. She told Brayll how her twin sister Candace had lived a life filled with privilege, while Melanie struggled to provide for her mother. Taking on Candace's identity wasn't easy, but it was the only way to secure the treatment her mother needed. I never meant to deceive you, Melanie whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought, by loving you, I could make amends for the lies I told. Brayll listened intently, absorbing every confession. Your love, Melanie, was never a lie, he finally said. It was your actions, your choice to protect your mother, that blurred the lines. But I need time to process this, to understand everything. I understand, she said quietly, squeezing his hands. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Brayll and Melanie grew closer to healing. They made small strides toward rebuilding trust, an intricate dance between the pain of the past and the hope of the future. One evening, as they strolled along the beach, the setting sun casting golden hues over the horizon, Brayll finally spoke what had been on his heart for weeks. Melanie, he said, his voice steady, will you give me the chance to rebuild the life we almost lost? Tears streamed down Melanie's face, but this time they were tears of hope. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I'll give you my heart, if you're willing to accept it. Brayll pulled her into a gentle embrace, and in that moment, all their broken pieces began to fit together. Their past was a part of who they were, but their love, a love that had been tested and reborn, was something worth fighting for. Together, they watched the sun disappear into the sea, a new chapter awaiting them with open arms. Weeks turned into months, and Brayll and Melanie's relationship deepened with a newfound sense of trust. Each day was a step forward, filled with conversations, shared experiences, and quiet moments where neither needed to speak to understand the other. They worked on rediscovering who they were, not as strangers, but as the people who had loved each other fiercely. Brayll had invited Melanie back into his life, not just as a partner, but as a confidant and a friend. Their home, once a place of shattered memories, began to feel like a sanctuary where love could flourish again. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Melanie curled into Brayll's side. She traced patterns on his chest with her fingers, savoring the warmth of his presence. "Do you ever think about what we lost?" Brayll asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Melanie looked up at him, her gaze gentle. "I think about it often," she admitted, "but I've learned that dwelling on what we lost doesn't help us move forward. It's in these moments with you where I find peace." Brayll pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, his love for her unshaken. "You've taught me that too." Their relationship wasn't without its hurdles. Trust was fragile, and it required both effort and patience. Brayll continued to remind Melanie that he was there, not just for the good times, but for the tough ones too. One afternoon, as Melanie prepared a surprise dinner for Brayll, she paused in the kitchen, lost in thought. The past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined who they were. They were more than mistakes and misunderstandings. They were a partnership built on mutual understanding. Brayll came home to the aroma of his favorite dishes filling the air. The sight of Melanie, bustling around the kitchen with a playful smile, warmed his heart. He leaned against the doorway, watching her with fondness. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble," Brayll said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "But I wanted to," Melanie responded softly. "For us. Because I love you, Brayll, more than words can ever express." In that quiet moment, the weight of their shared history seemed lighter. They were carving out their own path, one filled with love, understanding, and a promise never to let go. One evening, sitting on their porch overlooking the sea, Brayll took Melanie's hand in his. "What do you see when you look ahead?" he asked, his voice tender and curious. Melanie smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "A future filled with you," she answered simply. "A life where we create memories, build dreams, and share everything. No secrets, no lies." Brayll kissed her hand, his love for her profound and unwavering. "Then let's build it together, starting today." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Melanie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. They had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever came next, hand in hand. Months passed, and Brayll and Melanie continued to build their life together, learning to trust and heal from their past. Their bond had deepened, but there was still one piece of unfinished business: the day Melanie's mother had been told the truth. Brayll had promised Melanie they would tell her mother, but every time they brought up the topic, Melanie's hesitation kept them from taking that final step. She was afraid of the hurt and disappointment her mother would feel. However, Brayll understood that honesty was the only way forward. One afternoon, under a clear blue sky, they sat across from Melanie's mother at their favorite cafe. The warmth of the sun bathed them, but the weight of the conversation was heavy. "Mom," Melanie began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "There's something, Brayll, and I need to tell you." Her mother's eyes softened as she looked at them. "Go ahead, my child," she said gently, her voice full of love and curiosity. Brayll took Melanie's hand in his, a silent show of support. "I wasn't Candace," Brayll confessed. "I pretended to be her to help with your medical treatment. It was never meant to hurt you or replace your daughter. I love you and Melanie with all my heart." Tears streamed down her mother's face, but not in anger or sadness. There was relief, understanding, and a deep, abiding love. "I knew," she whispered. her voice choked with emotion. "I've always felt a piece of Candace's spirit in you. You've cared for me like a son, Brayll." Melanie cried quietly beside them, overwhelmed by the moment. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she managed to say between sobs. Her mother pulled both of them into a heartfelt embrace. "No more apologies," she said softly. "You've brought me happiness again. That's all that matters." With their family healed, Brayll and Melanie embraced a future filled with love and possibility. Their home no longer held the echoes of sorrow and pain. It had been transformed into a sanctuary of warmth, hope, and joy. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set, Melanie rested her head on Brayll's shoulder. The air was filled with the quiet hum of contentment. "I never imagined this could be real," Melanie whispered. Brayll turned to her with a gentle smile. "Sometimes, the most unexpected journeys lead us exactly where we need to be." Their laughter mingled with the sounds of crickets as they marveled at how far they had come. The past was a part of them, but it no longer defined their story. Together, they had built something beautiful, an unbreakable bond forged through trials and triumphs. As the stars began to dot the sky, Brayll took Melanie's hand in his. "Forever starts here," he said, his voice steady with love and determination. "Forever," Melanie agreed with a radiant smile. And so, under the vast, endless sky, they began a new chapter, one filled with endless love, unwavering trust, and a future they would build, one day at a time. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, and share for more delightful stories.